Was the U.S. Army on Guadalcanal? I get asked this question quite a number of times. And generally I say, yes, they were on Guadalcanal, and they were on Guadalcanal quite a bit. Or I get comments such as, the U.S. Army was on Guadalcanal, but they only did the mopping up. I said, no, that's not correct. Why is this? Why does a lot of people not know the U.S. Army is actually on Guadalcanal and the actual part they play on Guadalcanal? I've written down a few reasons from my research that I thought would actually fulfill that. And there's three good reasons I thought. Richard Kurgaskis. Now, as you probably know, he wrote the book Guadalcanal Diary. He was one of the correspondents that landed on the beaches on 7th of August, 42 with the Marines. He wrote a great book, the Guadalcanal Diary, which later became a movie, all in 1943. So the American public was seeing the Marines, even though in the end of the movie and in the end of the book, it mentions the U.S. Army's role. But then you see the U.S. Army at the end of the movie, they come in and they take over the Marines. And I guess people think, oh, that's the mopping up bit. Kurgaskis actually left after the Army. I think he left in October when the Army were first coming in. Another reason, during the time year 1942, during the time of the actual fighting, you got to remember there hadn't been any major wins on the U.S. side. So Guadalcanal was starting to become major press focus, a major morale builder. And as you guys can probably know from watching my videos and reading on the Guadalcanal campaign, it was a seesaw battle. It wasn't until probably mid-November that the U.S. Was very confident they would actually win this campaign. So a lot of focus was on it. And obviously the public needed morale building, so everything was on the Marines. And especially in the heavy lifting areas as part of the campaign, especially from August to October and November. And Marine Corps history in itself, because the Marines are big on history and tradition, and Guadalcanal has morphed into a Marine Corps only battle. But as we know, all the services at the time was involved. It was a great dimensional campaign involving the cooperation of all the services. You had the Coast Guard there, you had the Army Air Force, you had the Navy and the Marines, and they all bound together to win this campaign. So what I've basically done, I've come up with a video, hopefully to rectify some of these issues and hopefully enlighten others on the U.S. Army's participation in Guadalcanal. And even though if you look in some of the other videos on my channel, I've went into depth on a lot of these U.S. Army battles during the Guadalcanal campaign. And I'll discuss these further in this video. This video, I don't intend to go into a lot of details on those battles because I've hit on those in the other episodes. So feel free to look in those and I can dive very deep, and I'm walking you through the battlefields of the U.S. Army campaign. So some people don't know, like the U.S. Army, it wasn't, they didn't do mopping up on Guadalcanal. They did heavy lifting themselves. They received the largest Japanese assault, or they were subject to the largest Japanese assault in October at Coffin Corner. They're also assigned to take the strongest Japanese defensive positions at Mount Austin and the Gifu, and we'll later discuss. So they wasn't mopping up. If you were to speak to the Army veterans of Guadalcanal, they didn't do any mopping up, only probably in the last month, you could say. In October, there were still 20,000 Japanese. In November, there's still 20,000 Japanese on the island, albeit they wasn't effective offensive fighting troops, but once again, they were dug into holes and fighting positions, and they were fighting to the last man. So that was hard fighting. So I'll put together this PowerPoint here. Now, this slides. Now, I've noticed in other YouTubes and documentaries that Guadalcanal, the U.S. Army's involvement is basically lightly touched upon, but never in detail. So hopefully we can go over some of that today, and we'll see how we go. Once again, this isn't for entertainment. This is my channel is pure history with no frills. So sorry you won't get music and bouncing balls and whistles and bells. Not saying anything wrong with that, but you won't get that on my channel, unfortunately, probably because I don't have the technical expertise. But I pride myself on getting the facts straight and doing a lot of research. So hopefully that's what you'll get from this. So once again, I'll start here in the first slide. These guys are actually from the Marical division. I'll speak on them a bit later. And this is a good photo. You can just see in the photo itself. Let's see if I can get a full screenshot for you. The photo itself, there's some Army guys, Army infantry guys holding a Arisaka Japanese captured weapon. And you can see they're fairly dirty. You can see the good sweat stains on them. One guy's got a knife in his belt. So that's a good overall photo. And I like this photo of the U.S. Army. That's why on Guadalcanal, that's why I picked it as the first slide. So when did they arrive on Guadalcanal? All right, they arrived on Guadalcanal from the very beginning, actually. And these are some of the Army guys you really never hear much of. Now, some of the you have studied the Guadalcanal campaign, especially the air campaign, and you'll know about the 67th Fighter Squadron and their P-400 planes. And there's a good photo of a P-400 there, and that's actually on the field at Henderson Field, and that's part of the 67th Fighter Squadron. So they were part of the Cactus Air Force, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on the Cactus Air Force. Hopefully one day I'll have an episode just on that. I'm not an air expert, so to speak, and hopefully I can bring someone on one day that can go into detail on the air campaign. It was such a vast campaign, same as the sea and the land. That's what makes Guadalcanal such an interesting campaign to study. But the 67th Fighter Squadron, they landed on the 22nd of August. And you got to remember, the Cactus Air Force, the original Marine Fighter Squadron and dive bomber, landed on the 20th of August. So only 2 days later, the Army was on the field, so to speak. They only landed on the 22nd, only 5 planes with their air crew. So very, very minor contribution. Then a number of days later, the rest of the squadron landed. Not to go into too much detail, but the 67th Fighter Squadron initially didn't think they were much help because the P-400s couldn't go up to altitude for a number of reasons to fight the bombers, the Betty bombers that were bombing the airfield. But they became their own and became very valuable in a close air support role. I think if you remember my discussion of Bloody Ridge, they're very instrumental on the last day of strafing the Japanese troops there at the base of Hill 1 of Bloody Ridge. But just for the purpose of this episode, the U.S. Army was basically on the ground from that day on. And that was the fighter squadrons, 67th. So a good one to study. So I recommend you do some further study on these guys. And also the B-17s were there too. And this is the 11th Bombardment Group. They were the guys who actually involvement of the Army. I'll just take a step back. They were involved in the Guadalcanal campaign before 7th of August because they were doing some bombing runs when the Japanese were building that airfield. And the 11th Bombardment Group was the guys actually doing the bombardment. And during the campaign, there was other B-17s that would land, and they would be based out of Henderson Field, or when it was later known as Bomber Field. And then throughout the campaign, the U.S. Army Air Force, because we didn't have a U.S. Air Force at the time, but the U.S. Army Air Force stationed a number of squadrons, fighter and bomber squadrons on Guadalcanal throughout the whole campaign, especially and after the land campaign ended, when it became a major base, support base for the rest of the Solomon Islands when they were fighting up the Solomons. Now, what I'll do, I'll go into details, and it'll be the order of appearance that these Army units arrived. The Marical Infantry Division. Now, the Marical Infantry Division, you're going to remember before the war, each U.S. Army Infantry Division had 4 regiments, 4 infantry regiments. So when the war started, or maybe right before the war, they went in a triangular organization. So they had 3 infantry regiments. So it left a spare infantry regiment. So some of them was morphed out and formed into other divisions. But initially, in the beginning of the Americans' Pacific campaign, in early 42, the Japanese were on the offensive, especially in the Southwest Pacific. They had to man a lot of these islands like Fiji, Samoa, New Caledonia. So some of these independent regiments that didn't have a division, so to speak, they sent these guys out, and these are all National Guard units. And they sent these units out to garrison these islands in anticipation that the Japanese may invade. So they're garrison units. In New Caledonia, which some of you guys know in the Guadalcanal campaign was a major rear area base, there were 3 infantry regiments and a number of independent artillery, engineer, and other supporting units, all based there. So what happened, they had these 3 infantry regiments and all these independent units, and they formed them into a division. And they were formed overseas. I think it was the only U.S. Army unit formed overseas. I know the U.S. Marines 6th Division was formed overseas at Guadalcanal. But they formed this division overseas, and they gave it a name called the Marical, the New Caledonia and American Division. So they morphed the name in the Marical Division. So it was a division by name only. I think officially it was known as the 23rd Infantry Division. But it was formed. It was formed in New Caledonia. So the Marines initially, when they landed in Guadalcanal, they thought we're assault troops. We're going to go in. We're going to make our amphibious assault. We're going to be there for a few weeks, and the Army's going to relieve us. But unfortunately, at that time, the Army didn't have any spare troops to relieve them. There was a number of issues. I won't go into much detail in this podcast, this video on that. But it got to the point at one stage in the campaign that they needed to be relieved. They needed to be relieved. They needed some reinforcements. I think Vandergrift, the division commander of the 1st Marine Division, said, look, I will hold to Halsey, to the admiral when he took over. I will hold, just give me some more troops. Then you had General Harmon, which was the U.S. Army head of the South Pacific. And he was a big instigator in trying to get more troops there to put troops on the ground. But they didn't have anyone to spare, actually, because they were garrisoning these units or these islands. But in October, they decided they'll send 1 Army Infantry Regiment. And this is, I have a whole separate episode. I think I did it about 4 or 5 months ago on the 164th Infantry Regiment. These are kind of, to me, they're one of my favorite infantry regiments of the campaign, Marine or Army. Yeah, a bunch of North Dakota and South Dakota National Guard guys. They're formed up in the 164th Infantry Regiment. So once again, I won't go into a lot of details on these guys. Feel free to go and look at my video on the 164th. But they were the first U.S. Army ground unit to land on Guadalcanal. Did they do any fighting? Yeah, they did a lot of fighting. In fact, they did so much fighting, and their quality was so good, so to speak. They were known as the 164th Marines. So when they first came in, obviously they wasn't an Army division there, so they became part of the 1st Marine Division. So they're actually part of the 1st Marine Division at the time for a long time. 164th, they gained the baptism of fire, so to speak. It was a big one on the first night they landed on the 13th of October, which is the night, the bombardment of the night of the battleships, as you remember, which is probably the most heaviest sustained naval bombardment suffered by any Allied troops in World War II. So this was their first night. Welcome to Guadalcanal. But they became very instrumental. They were used very quickly in the Battle of Coffin Corner, and that was the scene of the largest Japanese attack during the offensive, and largest and most severe in their last attack. So the 164th took the brunt of that, especially on the second night after the 1st Battalion, the 7th Marines, was moved up onto Bloody Ridge after they were in the flats. Once again, I have a lot of videos that cover all this in detail. But the 164th became very well known and was known as a very good outfit. So they set the stage, so to speak. And they were the first U.S. Army unit to be engaged in any offensive combat in World War II. Little side note there. So the next one is 182nd Infantry Regiment, the Massachusetts Infantry Regiment. So they landed in November, in mid-November. They were part of the big convoy that later a few days later became the naval battles of Guadalcanal. This was probably the big turning point of the campaign, that mid-November. So these were the 182nd landed on a heavily escorted convoy. They landed obviously unopposed. And this is a picture. So all the photos I've got here are the actual units. I just didn't throw some U.S. Army guys, didn't know what unit. But these are actually the 182nd. And they're landed. And obviously, they've landed at Lunga Point, which is one of the main landing areas. And there they are walking out, carrying their bags, trying to get acclimatized. And I'll go, after I go through these, I'll go in the battles, very small detail how these guys were involved. So these guys were only on the island a week, and they were thrown straight into heavy combat. Hadn't even been acclimatized yet. So the next unit of the Marechal de Land, once again, they were all in order, is 132nd Infantry Regiment from Illinois. And I think in one of my videos, or definitely on my Facebook site, this regimental badges, by the way, that's a regimental badge, actually found one of these laying on the ground near the Coffin Corner area when the 132nd went there after their fight on the Gifu to be put on a rest area, so to speak. And I thought that was quite interesting. So here's a picture of the guys that are up on Mount Austin in their fight for the Gifu, which I'll discuss a little bit later. Once again, the 132nd was known as a good unit too. They had a good reputation. So the next unit to arrive was a regular Army unit. The Marechal, like I discussed before, were National Guard units. The 25th Infantry Division was formed in, I think, 1941 in Hawaii. I think from some of the units that was regular units stationed in Hawaii, and they morphed into the 24th and 25th. But the 25th Infantry Division was a regular unit. They first seen combat at Pearl Harbor. They were part of the Schofield Barracks, and you've probably seen some of the movies with not the Pearl Harbor movie, but that one, but a few other ones where show the Japanese strafing the barracks. Generally, that's the 25th Infantry Division barracks. You'll see the Army infantry guys running around. From Here to Eternity is a good movie, and I'll discuss the book, The Thin Red Line, a bit later. But it's 25th Infantry Division. So they arrived in late December, mid to late December, early January. And they were officially relieved the 1st Marine Division. So when the 1st Marine Division, they started leaving about the first units in 8th December 1942. And the 25th actually officially relieved the whole division. So division came in, one division left, another division came in. And I'll talk a bit further on that when we talk about how the Army transitioned and took command over the Marines officially. So I've got these off the net on the right-hand side. I thought this was pretty good. I'm trying to see who it was. WWW. I'm sorry, I can't have credit to it, but it's actually from the 27th and 25th Infantry. There's some good figures there, and it's very accurate. The 27th Infantry Regiment, known as the Wolfhounds, very famous regiment, regular Army unit. So they had a number of, just like the Marines, I guess, old corps or old school NCOs and officers in there. And they had a lot of professionals, so to speak. The next to arrive was the 35th Infantry Regiment. For some reason, I lost my photo there. I'll have to apologize for that. I guess let's just say they were operating in the dark. Yeah, I don't know what happened there. Sometimes the technology, when it's on my normal slide, when I brought it over to this program, it didn't work. So I should have looked for the 7 Ps, huh? Anyway, there's enough photos of them. I'll show you a photo of the 35th and later. But the 35th was another regular Army unit, and they became heavily engaged around the Seahorse, who I'll discuss a bit later. There we go. The next one was the 161st Infantry Regiment, Washington State. So they were a National Guard unit. Also, they were known as the stepchildren of the division, so to speak. there's a good book. I've got a number of books I'll recommend at the end of this, and one of the books is on the 161st, is from a veteran, and he discusses the animosity they initially had. You had the 27th and the 35th who were regulars, and then you had these National Guard guys who they kind of looked down upon initially, and you'll see in the first battles that they gave the 161st a supporting role on the galloping horse and the seahorse, and they didn't put them into combat. But shortly after that, they got to go into combat, and they proved their worth. They proved their worth to the regular guys. So this is a photo I found not too long ago from a 161st webpage. And I thought that was pretty good. And it shows the actual guys in 161st on Guadalcanal. Looks like he's like an aid station, so to speak. Yeah, I can see the Red Cross down there, and he's putting a bandage on his hand. Especially in those climates, if you get a cut or anything, you really have to treat it, because they call it the tropical ulcers, and it was a major thing that they experienced. Now, this is a very unique regiment. This is an independent regiment. So the U.S. Army had two divisions, the Marical and the 25th, and they had the 147th Infantry Regiment with independent, the Ohio National Guard. Now, the reason I say the 147th Infantry, they're a very unique regiment. A lot of people don't know about, but they should know about them. And maybe, hopefully, I can educate you a bit on this. I'd say do further reading on these guys, because what they did was quite amazing throughout the whole Pacific. So these guys, they fought on Guadalcanal, they fought on Saipan, Tinian, Iwo Jima. You go, hold on a minute, Iwo Jima? Only that was a Marine Corps battle. Yes, it was a Marine Corps battle. It was the largest Marine Corps battle in history, with 3 Marine divisions. But the 147th landed. They didn't land on D-Day. I think they landed maybe 3 weeks later. They're involved in a lot of fighting too, especially after the Marines left. They're involved in a lot of the fighting for the cage and digging the Japanese out. And get this, they're also in Okinawa. These guys are everywhere. They did a lot of mopping up on these islands, but they sustained a lot of heavy combat. They did quite a lot of good work in their first combat on Guadalcanal too. So look these guys up, the 147th Infantry Regiment. Quite amazing story. Now, Major General Alexander Patch. Now, photo on the left. Let me get this. Yes, okay. The photo on the left, you have General Pertus. You have Alexander Patch in the middle. And on the right-hand side, you have Brigadier General Seabury. Now, Pertus obviously was the assistant division commander of the 1st Marine Division. Patch, at this stage, was the Major General commanding officer of the Marical Division. And on the right-hand side is Seabury, who is the Brigadier General, the assistant division commander of the Marical. So here they are, a famous photo. They're handing over and they're getting briefed. It's probably for the stage for the photos, but they're getting briefed. There's another one I have of him and Alexander, Vandergriff. So Archer Vandergriff and him are actually doing the same. So they handed over. Officially, they handed over on the 8th of December, 1942. They handed over command. Now, this photo on the right-hand side of Patch is obviously he's a lieutenant general, and it was later toward the end of the war. Some of you might have heard of Alexander Patch before, because after he left the Pacific, he went on to the European and commanded an army in the European campaign, American army in European campaign in France and Germany. So he went on to bigger and better things, I guess you could say. But Patch, once he landed there, he was, just like I just mentioned, he was the division commander of the Marical Division. And then once it was handed over, he became the whole commanding officer of all the forces on Guadalcanal. And later morphed into a corps, which we had the U.S. Army 14th Corps, and he became the corps commander of the 14th Corps. And General Seabury then took over command of the Marical Division. Once again, Patch is a good study. I'd highly recommend that you read further on Alexander Patch. This guy here, He's one of my favorites. And being a former Marine, I shouldn't say that because he was instrumental or tried to get rid of the U.S. Marines after the war, but I won't fault him for that. There's a number of reasons I like him. One, my grandfather served under him in France, in Germany, in his corps. So Major General Joe Collins. There's a couple of good books on him. I highly recommend you reading his books. So he was the 25th Division Commander. He was a guy that led from the front. You notice, you probably can't see it in this photo. On the photo on the left-hand side, I like this photo. It's not on Guadalcanal, but it's right after Guadalcanal. It's a photo of him on Munda, New Georgia area. That's where the guys went after Guadalcanal. So the guy on the left-hand side is then Major Charles Davis, and I'll discuss him in a minute. You might know the name. I've got a whole episode just on him. He earned a Medal of Honor on Guadalcanal. And there he is, Collins on the right-hand side. But you notice Collins got an M1 carbine. So he was a major general that ran around with rifles and carbines, and he fought from the front. He led from the front. He did this even when he became later as Lieutenant General, Corps Commander. Okay, here we are on the right-hand side. There's Collins on the far right. Got his picking his teeth or something. Very famous photo. It's on Hill 66. I know exactly where this site was. So recently, someone sent me a news footage of the time, and it shows these guys. I guess one of the guys took a photo, but it shows a newsreels footage, and Collins is actually pointing up to the Galloping Horse, which is a series of ridges south, and he's probably describing the fight that his division did to the Secretary of Navy, which is to the left there with his helmet on backwards. And then you have Admiral Nimitz without a helmet in the middle. And then on the right-hand side between Nimitz and Collins, you have, some of you might recognize him. That's Halsey. So it's a fairly famous photo. But Collins, he led from the front. And you probably remember, if you go to my video, the Charles Davis and the Galloping Horse, I mentioned the fact that at one stage, Collins was about 250 yards away. And he was actually on the radio calling artillery fire himself. There's great stories on Guadalcanal about Joe Collins. There's one time he's walking through, and there was a machine gunner having issues with his machine gun. So Collins took his time, and he got the guys together, and he stripped the gun down, and he put it back together, and he showed them where to sight it in and everything. And that was a major general. And another time there was a Japanese sniper firing out of a tree, and Collins took an M1 and he started firing back. I don't know if he hit the Japanese, but he stood there under fire. So he was very very well liked and admired division commander. All right, there was 3 Army Medal of Honors earned on Guadalcanal. The guy on the left is Charles Davis. I'll just discuss him. And I have a video on all of these guys. And if you were to go and look at them, I'm actually the Pacific War Channel. I highly advise you to look at their channel. I've done a series of the Medal of Honors on Guadalcanal in conjunction with the Pacific War Channel. So they're coming out. I think the ones on Davis, Fournier, and Hall's one episode, and that should be coming out in the next 2 weeks. And then my video on the Charles Davis Medal of Honor, I highly recommend that one because it shows the terrain on the Galloping Horse, which is a series of ridges where these guys fought. It's probably the best preserved battlefield on Guadalcanal. The terrain looks exactly the way it did at the time. And the actual site where he earned the Medal of Honor is there, with the 2 Japanese bunkers in reverse slope is there too. So I highly recommend you go to that video. You'll probably hear me dying on that video from lack of water, because I tried to silly or stupid replicate what these guys did. They attacked up that ridge with 1 canteen of water, and it's a great study on how heat injuries can stop an assault in its tracks. So I decided to do it too with 600 mils water bottle. You can hear me almost dying in it. Probably not the smartest thing, but anyway. So I highly recommend you read up on these guys and see those videos. Now, I'll get my face off here so you can see the full map. I'm just going to briefly go over these because, once again, I've mentioned them in my other videos, and go into those if you want an in-depth view of them, and I'll walk you through on my videos. I'm giving you a little one-on-one tour, so to speak. So, Battle of Henderson Field. I mentioned before, 164th Infantry. This was the site that's the most sustained and heaviest Japanese assault during the campaign. Coffin Corner, they were called it. And this is also the area where the famous Marine John Basilone earned his Medal of Honor with 1-7, 1st Battalion 7th Marines. So after the first night, after heavy fighting, the 1st Battalion 7th Marines moved from that jungle flat up onto the ridge with the rest of the battalion. And then the 164th, who was in that area before, they took over that whole complete sector. And then the next night, the Japanese attacked with a larger force at that place at Coffin Corner, more sustained attack. So the 164th did quite well. They held, and they were accounted for over 2,000 Japanese dead there. And they gained a good reputation after that. And actually, that was part of their U.S. Navy and Marine Corps Presidential Unit citation. And one of their battalion commanders, Lieutenant Colonel Hall, earned a Navy Cross, which is kind of unheard of for our U.S. Army to receive that medal. So the next battle in line involved the 164th also. It was the Battle of Coley Point. And had 2 battalions of the 164th assisting the U.S. Marines at the Battle of Coley Point. And actually, General Rupertus, who I mentioned before, was the overall commander here. I think the 2nd or 3rd day into the fight, he became stricken with dengue fever, and he went down. And then General Seabury, the U.S. Army Brigadier General, took overall command, independent command. So it was the first independent command the U.S. Army had. This was the 4th and the 9th of November, 1942. The 164th, once again, this is the first time they maneuvered, so to speak. They did defensive fighting before, but they did some maneuvering. There was, once again, they're inexperienced for maneuvering. Maneuvering is a bit harder. Offensive operations and defensive operations for coordination and a number of other factors. So they kind of hesitated here, but overall they did quite well, and they still upheld their reputation. But there was almost half U.S. Army, half Marine battle there. The next one we'll see, I'll go back on the 1st of November. One battalion, the 164th, was involved in a Marine offensive there, limited involvement, so they were involved. So on the 18th to the 20th, the 182nd had landed a week earlier. So the 182nd was put in line with the 164th. And the fight for the Point Cruz line, as we call it. The Point Cruz line, if you go to Honiara today, that's downtown Honiara, which is the capital city. It's heavily built up over. The Parliament House is there. A number of the tourist hotels are there. Unfortunately, in some of the big week-long tours, especially U.S. tours that go over there, they hardly ever mention this area. This is hardly mentioned because it's not the Bloody Ridge. It's not Battle of Henderson Field. It's not Alligator Creek. But the most sustained and heaviest combat and the longest combat for the whole Guadalcanal campaign occurred between Point Cruz, there at the top, and the Matanical River to the right. So the 164th and 182nd was involved in these. And then the Japanese had a lot of rear area defensives there. You'll see them on the left. Rear slope defenses. And they were dug into that area. So the 182nd in its first attack was assigned to take these ridges. And unfortunately, the Japanese had landed, well, fortunately for the Japanese, unfortunately for the 182nd, the Japanese had landed a fresh unit. And they were going to start their offensive, commence another offensive in November. And they intended, just like they did in October, is to push the Marines and the Army back across Matanical to serve as a platform for their heavy artillery and tanks. They needed to get across Matanical. So you'll notice the top there, there's 3 red arrows. That's the Japanese attack. And the 1st Battalion of the 182nd had just arrived a week. They'd moved up in that area. And unfortunately, in their first combat, the Japanese hit them quite hard. And they call it in the official books, they retrograded. But if you read the accounts, they basically turned and ran. They moved back about 400 yards until General Seabury and a number of other senior officers who were on site kind of rallied them and stopped them. And then they reconsolidated their lines and able to fight and push the Japanese back. Now, the 164th had been pulled back when the 182nd had taken over. Now, I read the accounts of the 164th. They were not impressed that they had to go back because they were pulled back to rest, but they were then sent back in, and there was no love lost between the 182nd and 164th at that stage. But that was the only time I ever read any of the campaign that the Army really didn't live up to its standards, so to speak. Once again, it's a very beginning campaign. The Marines made mistakes. The Army made mistakes. These things happen in their first time in combat. This is just a map, a better map. It actually dispositions. I'm just reading it 0630 on the November 23rd. I go into a lot of these detail on these offenses, November offenses in the 164th video. So have a look at that if you want to go more detail. And I have a lot of then and now photos. I have a lot of more aerial photos, a lot of more maps. I'll explain it a lot more in detail. Hard fighting for the 164th and 182nd. And some of the 8th Marines, the 2nd Marine Division, had arrived at that stage also. Now, this is the 14th Corps. I mentioned Patch had taken over the 14th Corps. So the 1st Marine Division was gone by this stage. So December was kind of a resting stage for the Army. Because at that stage, the 25th hadn't arrived. The 1st Marine Division was leaving. The Maricao Division was the only division there, and some of the elements of the 2nd Marine Division, a couple of regiments. So Patch didn't have enough guys really to hold the island and go on the offensive. He was basically in the same situation the 1st Marines Division was in the first couple of 2 or 3 months there. So he had to hold the airfield. Because you got to remember, the Japanese didn't have any further plans to take offensive actions against Guadalcanal, but the Allies thought they were. So they were still guarding that airfield. That was the most vital terrain. So December was kind of a rest and refit, prepare for the January offensives. So the January offensive Patch had planned was basically to, in the bottom, and I'll go from more videos, more slides a bit below. So you had the Gifu, which is Mount Austin, in the bottom right. They had to isolate that. The big thorn in their side, so to speak. Once they wiped out the resistance on Mount Austin, then they could push for a major offensive once the 25th Infantry Division was there. So he had, and the rest of the 2nd Marine Division was landing in early January. So at that stage, you would have had 3 divisions and an independent regiment. So you had 1 division was going to hold on to the airfield, and the other 2 divisions were going to push straight down the coast there in a western push to eliminate the Japanese. Patch had very simple orders from Nimitz and Harmon, and that was to eliminate the Japanese on Guadalcanal. So that's what they were going to do. Before he could push westward, he had to eliminate the Gifu, or the guys on Mount Austin. So 18 to 27 December, I'll backtrack a bit. The 132nd had only been landed probably a week also. I have a good video, or 2 good videos on the Gifu, and it explains in detail how this occurred. But the 132nd was thrown into combat. So what they thought they were going to eliminate a few Japanese on the Gifu turned out to be bigger than they thought. And they were in there from 18 to the 27th of December to 132nd. And they fought very hard, especially Hill 27, the Gifu. You had over 500 Japanese in there with about 50 coconut enforced log bunkers in a horseshoe shape, about 1,500 yards. And they were dug in. So this is the the strongest defensive positions the Japanese had during the Guadalcanal campaign. And they gave it to the 132nd to crack it. These guys had never been in combat before. 1 week on the island, go crack this nut, so to speak. They were unable to eliminate the Gifu, but they held the Japanese in place, and they kept them from getting reinforced. They wore them down. So they were there, and they held them to the 27th of December. Then they were relieved by the 35th Regiment of the 25th. I like this. I put this in here because I thought you'd appreciate it. So this is a original U.S. Army sketch of the Gifu, and I only recently came across this. See if I can get it a bit larger for you. Okay. So how good is this? It's pretty good. And there you'll see the Mount Austin. It was 31 and 27, which is the Gifu area. You get the 182nd and the 132nd. Very hard terrain in that area. So if you go to my videos, you'll see the terrain, how hard it looks. And to actually maneuver, and it's quite amazing what these guys did in there. Now the 25th Division is arrived on the island, so they're ready for combat offensive operations. So you had the Galloping Horse, and they captured the Seahorse. So they had to isolate the Gifu, so to speak, because Japanese were giving some supply, limited bit of supply to the west side of the Gifu, straight up those cliffs. So they had to isolate the Seahorse and the Galloping Horse. Go to my videos. I've got one on the Galloping Horse, got one on the Seahorse. It explains it in detail. I can't stress enough, if you really want to see how well a battlefield is on Guadalcanal today, go to that Charles Davis, The Thin Red Line, I call it. And I'll mention at the very end, there's this book, The Thin Red Line, and the movie The Thin Red Line. I'll talk a little bit about that and why it's called that and why I recommend that book. It's very hard fighting there. So the 3 Army Medal of Honors, one was earned, the one on the left, the Galloping Horse, and the other 2 was earned at the Seahorse, a Fournier and Hall, 2 machine gunners. Very hard terrain in there. Very, once you walk it, once you see it, once you get a great appreciation of what these guys did there. One of the most favorite photos of all. We were up on this area. This is the Galloping Horse. And that's why I say it's the most perfectly preserved battlefield on Guadalcanal. There's only one hut there. The rest of it's in situ. The way it looked from, I guarantee I could bring a veteran back if I could in time and drop in there and go, is this what you've seen? He would say, yes, but there's no Japanese there and someone's built a hut. Other than that, this is what you get. So we were up there, and I had one of his friend's sons put a drone up, and he snapped that. So I just did some notations on there. You have the different hills. Then if you look up, this is basically facing north. So you're looking northeast. That's Lunga Point, Henderson Field, the distance, overlooking Iron Bottom Sound. In the far distance, you have the Florida Islands. So maybe pause on your watching this and just have a good look at that. It's a great one. So here's the attack. Once again, once they isolated the Gifu, they pushed off. I'll just mention this. It had something called the CAM. And I mentioned it in my 164 videos, the Combined Army and Marine Division, which is a very unique division. It was only short-lived for a few weeks on Guadalcanal. So they had the 6th Marine Regiment, the 147th Regiment, and the 182nd Regiment. And that was the CAM division. You've got to remember, I haven't mentioned a lot of the other supporting units. You had engineers, quartermasters, a lot of independent artillery units. I mean, I could go into a lot of detail, but I'm not. But there was a lot of U.S. Army units involved in this fighting, especially a lot of artillery. And the Army played a major part and role in early November when they brought the 155 millimeter howitzers in, because at that time the Marines had 155 millimeter howitzers, but they had left them in New Zealand from the very beginning because of the weight. And when the Japanese Pistol Petes, which were the 100 millimeters and 150 millimeter howitzers the Japanese had in cannons, they would bombard Henderson Field, and the Marines didn't have anything to counter battery fire until The U.S. Army landed with it was a coastal artillery unit, 70th Coastal Artillery Unit, landed with the 155 Long Toms. And then the Marines had their old 1918 Snyders, I believe they were called, 155s, which landed a number of days later. And then they were able to provide accurate counter battery fire. So yeah, so that combined Army Marine unit's a very unique unit, and they work quite well together. You hear all the kind of the fallacies about how the Army and the Marines hated each other in the war, but you don't see that once you get on the ground. The final phase, they pushed the Japanese off. Japanese end of Operation K, evacuated on those nights between the 1st and the 8th of February, evacuated about 11,000 Japanese off. You'll see there on the left-hand side, the Army did a couple of small amphibious assaults. You had one at Buford Bay, which is kind of off the mount at the bottom, because there was a trail that went from Kukubana, which is the Japanese 17th Army headquarters. It crossed the mountains to the south coast of Guadalcanal. So they landed a small unit there. Then they landed the 2nd Battalion of the 132nd, reinforced there at Verahue. And shots fired in anger is a book I'll recommend. I'll show you in a minute at the end. I recommend that he talks, the veteran that wrote the book, who was part of that unit, he talks a lot in detail about that landing. And there was a small pincer movement when you had the 147th leading up the coast. So here's just some photos. I'll see if I can get a bit larger for you, of U.S. Army units on Guadalcanal. So obviously on the left-hand side, they're stacking their M1 Garands. Right-hand side, this is the area on the bottom side of Hill 30 on Mount Austin. Those foxholes and stuff are still there. Very well preserved area. That's General Seabury, actually. If you enlarge the photo, he has a big knife on his front. So he's walking there with, I guess, one of his aides, or maybe the company commander of that area. And that's what the Americans did. The 132nd, when they're up on the Gifu, they dug in on those rear slopes. And you'll see in a lot of my videos of how I show you the bunker holes are still there, and they dug in on rear slopes. And then the fighting was up in the thick jungle there. It's hard getting supplies of these guys. That little trail they're on, that's how they got their supplies. They'd have to man pack them out. Once again, on the left-hand side, that's on, all this is out in Mount Austin. Some of the rear slopes of the U.S. Army was there. Right-hand side's a famous photo. I think it's a time-life photo of a U.S. Army soldier there on Mount Austin. I don't know what hill that is. I think it's hill 40, 41, 42. And that's overlooking, looking west over his shoulder. And he's got his M1 there ready to go. That's what the 155 millimeter howitzers I mentioned before. I don't know exactly what Army unit this is, but that is an Army unit. And they're firing that counter battery fire, potentially, well, they're providing a lot of good artillery support to those 14th Corps offensive later in January. Right-hand side, you get the Pusha Maru. That's what the U.S. Army nicknamed these small Japanese boats they had captured up the Matanikaw River, and it became a source of supply. The Pusha Marus, they call them. See, obviously Maru was a Japanese name for a transport ship, and then the Americans put Pusha for obvious reasons, so they're pushing it up to the Matanikaw River. That's how they'd get supplies in and wounded out. And they also had rails on stretchers, and they had a pulley system that they would actually use. Guy on the left-hand side is the first sergeant with the 164th. And he's in his bunker there. The guy on the right-hand side's an officer. I'm thinking he's with the 132nd. They wore a lot of these overalls, I noticed. The one-piece overalls, they're quite prevalent. I've found remnants of them, and you see a lot of photos. It's mainly the Marical Division in these overalls. Contrary to what you see in the movies, there were no M1 carbines during the Guadalcanal campaign. So that on the right-hand side, I know exactly where that position is. So he's on the forward northern slopes of Mount Austin. And over his right hand shoulder is Lunga Point, where the airfield. So he's unique about this. He's got his he's an officer, and he's got his epaulets or his rank turned inwards, which makes sense. So a Japanese sniper wouldn't get him. And also you see little sticks there, and they used to take their helmets, and they'd use them as the cook on, and they'd put them between those two sticks to boil their water or heat their chow up in, so to speak. There's a number of photos I highly recommend if you go on the web and look up Sergeant Howard Brody or Brody's Guadalcanal sketches. He mainly did them on the U.S. Army. They're great sketches, and he goes in a lot of details. And I'll provided, I think, 4 here just to look at. And one on the right-hand side, along a jungle trail, found this rugged boy, infantry. He was Private Arthur Newer, machine gunner. Howard Brody, Yank staff artist. So there's a U.S. Army guy there, and he's got his beard. He got his leggings, I think, and he's got his shorts cut out, and he's got a big pistol. And once again, the left-hand side's a real hard thing the guys had to do. They had to do medical evacuations, so he really captured that. So go in, and there's a number of great sketches he made. There's a couple of other ones. The one on the left-hand side is very famous. You've probably seen it a number of times. Sketched inside of a bunker, and he listed their names too, which is good. They handled a 30 caliber heavy machine gun. All these sketches are made during a push on Mount Austin. Right-hand side, the U.S. Army advancing down the road to Kukumbona. There's a dead Japanese there, some destroyed Japanese artillery. You can just see the rugged appearance of the Army guys, especially the 164th and 132nd. They were the first guys there, and just like the Marines, they were suffering from debilitating diseases, malaria, jungle rot, dysentery. So the jungle was smashing them also. Now, a few of the books recommendations. If you want to get an overall, the best book on Guadalcanal for the U.S. Army, or I'll just say one of the better ones for Guadalcanal overall, is this one. I've got a link there. You can go in and type it up. It's Guadalcanal, the First Offensive by John Miller. You can find it all online, and it's got all these maps I showed you, the great maps links, so you can get it online. But the book, it was written in 1949. It's part of official U.S. Army history. It goes in a lot of detail, and it has a lot of good references. If you want a best overall, most detailed book on the U.S. Army's involvement, Guadalcanal, John Miller, Guadalcanal, the First Offensive, the official U.S. Army history of the campaign, 1949. You can find it online. Go there. If you don't read any other book, read that one. There's a number of other memoirs that I recommend. I've read them all. They Were Ready, the 164th in the Pacific War. It's a good one. Combat Infantry one. That's a great story about Donald Anderson. He was a veteran, the 35th Infantry Regiment. So he was a pre-war soldier, and that goes in a lot of good detail. And obviously, he's got Pearl Harbor, Guadalcanal, Luzon. So these guys fought in the Philippines. Next one, I highly recommend this one too. Combat Officer, The Memoir of the War in the South Pacific by Charles Walker. Charles Walker, I'm pretty sure was in the 164th. He goes in a lot of detail about the Battle of Coffin Corner and the fights around the Matanikau area. So 164th suffered heavily in the fights for the Matanikau, the Point Cruz ridges. And he actually, I think he goes on to be one of Merle Marauders. I have to double check. It's been a while since I read that one, but it's a real good book overall, and it talks about his fighting in the Philippines. Across the Dark Islands, I think this is the one I mentioned, the 161st by Floyd Rendicki. I hope I'm saying that correctly. Across Dark Islands. Orchards in the Mud. I've been trying to find this. It's one book of all these I'm recommending I haven't read. I want to find it. It's obviously for posting to Guadalcanal. Yeah, I wish I was back on Guadalcanal. Posting to Australia is very high. So maybe one day, if Santa Claus is good to me, I'll get this one. I've been told it's a very good book. Next one, highly recommend it. Shots Fired in Anger by John George, 132nd Infantry Regiment. This guy was a pre-war marksman, heavy in the shooting competition. He goes in so much detail on the weapons used on Guadalcanal. just if you want to read it just for that fact alone, read that one. It's a great book overall. Thin Red Line. This is one I mentioned before, James Jones. James Jones was in the 2nd Battalion of the 27th Regiment, 25th Division. Now, he fought, he was a corporal. He fought up on the Galloping Horse Ridge. He was wounded there, I think, by a mortar round. And then after the fighting, when he left Guadalcanal, I think he was he had a number of issues, and then he got a medical discharge. He wrote about his experiences in the Thin Red Line and From Here to Eternity. Now, even though it's a fiction book, it's based on his fiction, based on his actual accounts. I mean, if you read, for example, he just changes names. I think the Galloping Horse Ridge is called the Dancing Elephant, but when he mentions names of commanders, they're changed. But it's a very long book, very, very long movie. But I highly recommend, if you get a chance, read Thin Red Line. It really depicts the fighting on Guadalcanal, especially from a pre-war soldier, an old professional soldier's point of view. The next one's Under the Southern Cross. I haven't read this one. It's the Marical Division. I want to get that one. Next one's Fire and Fortitude by John McManus. Now, John's doing a great work here. He's got a trilogy. I think he's put out 2, and I don't know when the next one's going to be published, but he's following the U.S. Army role in the Pacific, which is kind of not known. I mean, not so much Guadalcanal, but the rest of the Pacific. A lot of people don't even think the Army was in the Pacific, but it's just, they were. There's a lot more Army was in the Pacific than the Marines. They carried a lot of heavy lifting. The Fire and Fortitude is a good one. He doesn't go in a lot of detail on the U.S. Army's role on Guadalcanal. He kind of hits the wave top, so to speak. But he writes very well, and it's easy to follow. If you want a good overall view on the U.S. Army's participation in the Guadalcanal campaign, I recommend John McManus' book, and I recommend the rest of his books to follow the whole U.S. Army's involvement in the war. The more detailed account, once again, go back to Miller's account, the one I recommended at the very beginning. I think that's it. I'm at the end of my slides. So we went for an hour. Okay. I can talk for a long time. So hopefully, viewers, you've got a bit out of this and you've learned a little more. I highly recommend you do further reading on your own and look at my other videos to follow the U.S. Army's fight on Guadalcanal. But the U.S. Army was on Guadalcanal and they're heavily involved. And just like all the other servicemen, they suffered greatly. In fact, they had over 500 killed, and I wrote this down. It changes. 1,289 wounded in action. So that's a big sacrifice these guys did. And there's a number of U.S. Army still on Guadalcanal missing, was put in unmarked graves. And hopefully they'll all be found one day. So let's just hope that. So if you got any questions or comments, or if you want to expand further on any other units on Guadalcanal, hopefully I'm going to do the air and more the naval. But if you want any more, especially ground campaign recommendations, or you want any further questions on the U.S. Army's role, put it in the comments. And I also have the Guadalcanal Walking of Battlefield Facebook page. And there you can send me a personal PM message, and I can assist you, especially if you have any veterans in your family that were U.S. Army on Guadalcanal. I can help you track them down and show you where they fought. All right, so I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time.